audits and accounting at a lot of our hospital partnerships. We started out with Jordan Pace, who's one of the partners that John's known for a long time. He's kind of has this reputation. I'm not sure if they realize his reputation, but it's one where he comes in, he sets up, he makes.
Jordan swooped in and then Jordan swooped out. So I've learned a lot of things over my 19-year career at Plan Moran from Jordan. One of them is, though, that you meet your obligations. So that's why he's got me here today. And Ashley is actually going to be the expert that tells you all the good stuff. So listen to her. Most of my stuff is kind of the fluff. But we are going to start out kind of with our agenda for the day. We have about, let's say, 50 minutes, maybe 45 here. We'll try to run through this rather quickly and keep most of you awake. I had a lot of jokes, but I had to cut those out based on the 401k presentation. Well, that's the first joke of the day. Success. We're going to talk a little bit about healthcare reform, talk about financial statements. So as we're talking about financials today, I want you to always think about your own financial situation, because it helps me when I think about a hospital's financials, a pain management clinic's financials. What are my own financials, and how does that compare to another organization's financial statements? And we'll talk about that. You'll get a bigger picture, because I see somebody already rolling their eyes going, CPA what? Ratios and indicators. So what benchmarking can you do? Budgets, financial planning, couple other items here, decision support, and then I think it'll be a separate group that's going to talk a little bit about reimbursement specifically. Triple aim. So if we're talking healthcare, in my mind, healthcare is focusing more and more on this. So think back to your own personal life here. Improve quality care for patients. So we all want that. Reduce expenditures, less cost. And finally, improve the health of the community. So it's not just about ourselves, but it's about our families, it's about our friends, it's about our communities. And so really when we're going to talk about healthcare reform, there's so many things going on in Columbus, there's so many things going on in Washington, but at the end of the day, people are trying to get to these three things. As we flip to the next page though, we will see that these are all the equations that they're attempting to use to get there. It's a lot of stuff going around, and really there's no foolproof solution in healthcare reform. It's try this, try that, let's keep trying to move the ball in the right direction. So what is the formula for success? As you can see, as mentioned here, there are a lot of different formulas to move us in that direction. But here are maybe 6 key criteria that we usually look at. So first of all, it starts with leadership. Luckily, each of you are in leadership roles, and so you can make an impact in healthcare reform. Collaborating across the care continuum. Where does this start? It may start from birth till hospice care and everything in between. So collaborating across that continuum. And really, I always say, healthcare is a good portion my responsibility as the patient. Track, report, and monitor key metrics. So if you're not measuring something, it won't get done. Ask your kids that if you have kids. If you don't measure if they clean their room, does it get done? Typically not. Core competency and revenue cycle. So in our wonderful system in the U.S., you have to bill and collect, bill and get paid. And if you don't have a really good understanding of how to do that, and you're not going to be around for a long time. Appropriate use of information technology. So sure, you can try to run your clinic on paper and pen, but there are so many ways that you can use technology nowadays, and they're just growing exponentially each day. And then finally, this is what we're trying to do here, and it's going to be done by whittling away. It's not going to be a big chunk, but overhauling the care delivery system, getting the patient to the right spot in the care delivery system with the right providers. So the who, the where, and then how do we pay for it. So that's kind of the brief kind of healthcare reform, setting the landscape for the financial discussions in healthcare. And as I said, I will turn it over to Ashley. That was your appetizer. It is now time for the main course.
All right, so we're going to get into more details on the financial statements themselves. So 2 statements that you're going to see within your financial statements are your balance sheet and your income statement. Net assets, and it's really very, as it's named, balance sheet always needs to be in balance. Your income statement, on the other hand, it's showing what your revenues are for a period of time. Also your expenses, and the difference in those is really your net income or your provision for future services.
As I'm clicking the next page, I will mention if we have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to answer those. There will be a Q&A session at the end too if it's a question that doesn't need to be addressed immediately.
Yeah, but we would like this to be as interactive as possible because we know it can be a little bit dry, I guess, depending on what you're interested in.
I have a question, we'll go back to that assets, equal liabilities and equity. Could you maybe explain, assets are things you own, liabilities are things that you own?
That's coming
Yeah,
right
what's
up.
equity? I mean, kind of-
So equity, and that is coming up in the future slide, but it is really your accumulation of your earnings, your income since inception. And it's really the difference, if you think about your assets and your liabilities, your assets minus your liabilities equal your equity, and that, again, it's an accumulation of what you've earned over since inception for that, whether you're looking at a department or a hospital or a separate entity.
Yeah, so think about it, I go back to my own personal situation. Think if the only asset you had was a car, and you drove to work and back, and you made money and you made payments on that car. Day one, when you take the loan out for that car, you have zero equity in the car. After 60 months, you've paid your wages over that, and now you have 100% equity in that car. Now, obviously, it's depreciated and not worth as much, but now your equity in that car, because you went to work every day and then you paid your car payment, and that was the only thing you did. You've gained equity over that period of time, and now instead of having $10,000 liability, you have $5,000 of an asset and $5,000 of equity. It's mine. I own it. The bank doesn't own it.
So the balance sheet is a picture, a snapshot of your financial position, like at a specific point in time. So it could be your year end, a quarter end, a month end. It's also could be referred to as your statement of financial position, or in the case of a consolidated financial statement, a consolidated balance sheet. So your assets are what you own. We also have a car, your cash in the bank. Liabilities is what you owe. Your loan on that car, if it's still outstanding, may just be routine. You're purchasing supplies or services and need to pay for those. And then again, your equity or your fund balance is really your accumulation of your net income, or the difference between what you own and what you owe. You'll also see on the balance sheet that it's typically classified. And what does that mean? So I think in your case, everything that you're seeing on your balance sheets, everything is current. And what that means is you're intending to use that within a year. So in the case of an asset, your cash, you would expect to use that within the year, or your accounts receivable, plan to collect the majority of that within the year. And liabilities, you would plan to then pay them within a year. And then non-current would be something that would extend beyond a year. So in the example of a car loan, if you're gonna pay that over 5 years, you would have both a current and a long-term portion. This here is a snapshot of what should look familiar as a pain management balance sheet. And as I said, everything you see here is current. So you have current assets, you have current liabilities, and you even go as far as breaking out your equity in a little bit more detail than we sometimes don't always see. And it's nice because it shows kind of what was your beginning or your prior year earnings and what happened in the last year to come down to your total equity. So it shows where your position was at the beginning of the year, your prior year earnings, your current earnings, and then any distributions or contributions out of that business or that center that brings you down to your total equity at the end of the period. And again, you'll see always in balance. You like everything balancing, right?
You do.
We talked about some of this, but again, your cash is the money in the bank. Patient accounts receivable is really what you expect to collect. from patients, Medicaid, Medicare, commercial insurance. And then prepaid expenses is another common current asset, and that's really money you've paid for supplies or services that you haven't received yet. So you may get a discount by paying that in advance, and you're gonna receive that service over the next year or two.
Yep, think if you paid your lawn boy in May for the entire year of lawn services, then you'd have a prepaid that you don't have to pay him or her the rest of the year.
And then on the liability side, your accounts payable and other liabilities are pretty similar in that it's money you owe for supplies and services. Accrued payroll, it would be money set aside for employee hours that have been worked, but you just haven't paid them yet, and that's the end of the pay period. And so those haven't been paid. And then the difference, obviously, is your equity or your net assets. So we talked about the balance sheet being a position at a point in time. Your income statement is going to be reported for a period of time. It could be 1 month, it could be a quarter, it could be a year to date. And obviously that would be important in understanding what you're looking at and how those numbers compare. It's also you refer to as a statement of operations or statement of operations and changes in unrestricted net assets, depending on the entity. So there's also classification on the income statement. Again, in your case, everything that is presented on the income statement is operating income. So those operating revenue and expenses are really those items that relate to the sole purpose of the hospital or the department. So that would include your patient-related services, including ancillary services, rental income, your cafeteria. Non-operating are things that would not be related to your sole purpose. So investment income, if you sold an asset and had a gain on the sale of an asset, something to that effect. But again, I think in your case, you're seeing everything here is really your operation. It's all operating income, operating expenses, because it relates directly to your sole purpose of providing pain management services. And again, in this case, you'll see this is an example for a quarter to date. So drilling down to a little bit more detail on the income statement. Your revenue, you'll see a couple different things. You'll see your gross patient revenue, which is the charges for patient services according to your charge master. So that's what you are, if you had a self-pay patient, you would potentially bill them 100% of those. But for patients that have insurance or Medicare, Medicaid, you're also going to have some deductions from patient revenue. And a new terminology that I'm just going to throw out there is price concession. That's actually something that we're getting used to in our world, as there's a new revenue recognition standard that is effective for public entities starting in 2018. So you guys are the first to know, and you're going to be, if you throw out the word price concession, all your auditors will be really impressed. And those are really the differences between what you're billing and what you're ultimately going to collect based on a contract or based on regulations, which essentially don't allow you to collect 100% of your gross charges. And so this just shows kind of your initial charges, your $1,200. That would be based on what's on your charge master. If you are ultimately going to collect $500 from the payer, then your price concession is really the difference.
So think about this with my car analogy. So you go in and it's a $40,000 new car. How many people actually pay $40,000? Some. Don't raise your hand because that's probably not a good sign. But you may haggle down to $38,000, and I want a tire rotation thrown in there or whatever. Well, in the world of healthcare, many times that discount is already adjusted for you. There's a contract that says, if I work at pain management and I go in and I try to buy a car from the local Chevy dealer, I've already got a 15% discount because pain management has went on my behalf, and got that 15% discount. So when John's not doing what he does, maybe he can get you discounts on cars, right? But that's the essence of this, is that you're rarely ever going to pay full price for healthcare service. Medicare sets rates, Medicaid sets rates, commercial payer set rates, and there are many things that have occurred recently related to self-pay patients where you're required to get discounted rates if you come in and get a hospital level service. Did you have a question, John?
Well, you started to answer, but the question I hear often is, when you look at our financial statement, only the price concession can be 75%. Why does the hospital put in its charge master, or why do we recommend the hospital to have the charges that's 75% higher than what gets paid? Why aren't they closer together?
So there could be a number of reasons for that. The typical driver for that, one has been history, so you've accelerated your costs. The other is that there are certain payers that may pay all of that or close to all of that. So you would not want to set your rates at what Medicare is going to pay if from Blue Cross you can get $1,000 more. So you're setting a rate that is typically competitive in the marketplace for your service, but at the same time is going to hopefully maximize the cash that you're going to get in the door from those services. Does that help answer it? Other thoughts that you may have, or ways that you set your prices, John?
I'm just trying to ask the questions I hear. You guys jump in here and ask your questions, but.
Yeah, when we get to the end of Ashley's session, if John's the only one to ask questions, then I'm going to pick somebody to come up and juggle.
I'll save us. I actually do have a question.
Perfect.
So you said the price concessions, but that applies to public entities. So our terminology will remain the same with contractual adjustments, or?
It will all eventually change. It's just beginning in 2018. That terminology, yeah, it will eventually all get there. It'll take some time, but for non-public entities, the same revenue standard that I referenced is applicable the following year in 2019. They just have like a 1-year reprieve.
So maybe one other question you hear regularly, what's the difference between a revenue adjustment and a bad debt?
Well, in the price concession world, there is effectively no difference on your statement, your income statement. But there is a difference in a price concession, you agreed upon it. A bad debt, it wasn't able to be collected. So the definition of bad debt is, I tried to collect this from somebody, and they mainly said, I'm not paying it, I don't have the wherewithal to pay it, I'm not willing to go through the process to get it written off through a price concession or other means. So it's really the ability to pay, and that concession down to what your ability is, or the difference is unwillingness to pay is what really a bad debt is. So John remembers, not to age him because he's only, 35 now?
I told him earlier, I'm 100.
100, okay. That we used to have bad debt all over, bad debt has moved all over this income statement over the years. It's moved up, it's moved down, it's moved up, it's moved down. It's actually going to go away, and it's just going to be a price concession. I have good money, it will come back someday.
Technically, you could still have it, but it's not going to be significant enough to ever show up
I told you she's the smart one.
on your income. It's most likely you're not going to have it, but yeah. They've changed. Bad debt is an ever-evolving term. Other expenses, salaries and wages, obviously the cost of your employees, benefits, obviously they're related, your health insurance, retirement plan, got to hear about your 401k, professional physician services, expenses, maybe physician fees, clinical consulting services, lease and rent expense, your insurance, and then the bad debt expense, and that's, again, your non-cash expense incurred for patients that either do not have the ability to pay or do not choose to pay. And I did just point out on this slide that under the new revenue recognition guidance, technically, if you have a true bad debt where somebody does go into bankruptcy and cannot pay, it's no longer going to be presented up with your net patient service revenue, but rather as an expense. But we do not anticipate that being a huge number for most of the health systems and places that we work in. So you're, yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about the price concession and our contractuals,
Yes.
are,
Those-
those are gonna be separate?
They're all the same. So
Okay.
your contractual, what you know as like your contractual adjustments, your deductions from revenue, they're all, and even your, like your self-pay bad debt, you're deeming them to be bad debt because they're self-pay. Those are all gonna be considered price concessions.
Okay. And how long will they stay in there? I mean, at the end of the year, they start fresh, or, maybe because some of them will never pay?
So you mean, so when they are an
Or is it just
adjustment,
for a
you've written
quarter?
them off. But I guess as an allowance, so it's really, based on your internal policies, whether, how long you carry some of those that are on your books and the offsetting allowance versus, moving them from your books altogether, is that what you're referring to? Yeah, and I think that's really probably based on your own policy and what you've, what
So,
you've said.
so let's give an example here. Patient comes in, $100 charge, there's a price concession contractual adjustment for 50% on day one, because you believe you're gonna collect $50. Subsequent to that, 90 days goes by and you've been stiffed so far, but you believe, hey, I'm gonna be able to collect some of this. But I'm going to take an additional allowance, additional price concession on this, because typically once 90 days that I haven't collected, I'm not gonna collect everything, or historically I haven't. So I take another $25 of a concession into my income statement, and now my balance sheet reflects that I have $75 of price concessions on my $100 of gross charges. After a year, no payment, send it to some outside party, write it completely off, take the final 25% price concession, hit your income statement, and effectively, as you write that account off, it will,
We just
the entirety will
continue
go
to-
out, yeah, will go off the balance sheet.
Account for less. Okay.
Would it be fair to say that when you look at the balance sheet and you say accounts receivable, that already has the price concessions factored into it and is attempting to show the value of what cash you would expect to collect off of those accounts receivable at that point in time?
That's exactly how I would define it.
So theoretically, in a perfect world, that would move over when cash was collected. That would just be a transfer in your balance sheet that's already been in your income and your deductions.
Right. And obviously, as we all know, we estimate this receivable. We believe that we're going to get it. Sometimes we do, sometimes we get more. Sometimes we say, oh, we don't think we're going to get this, and then the collection agency comes back and collects it. But overall, net, as an estimate, you're believing, and a hospital is making their best estimate, that this $500,000 is going to move to cash. There are some little pieces that go in and out, but overall, that's the concept there.
So then you would say that revenue on the income statement is recognized, or is recorded on the income statement, not when cash is received, but when the service is rendered and the expense for that service is recorded.
So generally accepted accounting principles would require that. And so it is, as you said, you're not cash basis, you're accrual basis. And that accrual basis means that you record your net realizable value, what you believe you're going to get in cash, into accounts receivable on day one. Are there questions that sometimes is really important to understand? So are there other questions from the group besides what John is asking on recognition of revenue and specifically the timing? Okay. We may come back to that.
So your net income is calculated by taking your revenue less your expenses. And as we pointed out earlier, if you have net income, that will increase your equity or your fund balance on your balance sheet. Or if you have a net loss, that will decrease your net assets on the balance sheet. So that's really all from like the overall, like the financial statement. Before we get into some of the ratios, that's what we had as like prepared comments. Are there any questions on what you're seeing come through or what that represents, or any questions on the financials at all? Yes.
For AR, what is the business, or our industry standard of days?
Days in AR.
So for physician practices, you would tend to see 30 days or so. For hospitals, you would see a good benchmark is somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 50.
So Sarah, going back to your point, I want to make sure this makes sense to everybody. When we bill an account, that goes into revenue the day that encounter is seen. And the transaction is, you put it into revenue, an accountant would say you credit revenue and you debit something now we own called accounts receivable. And then you reduce it by a price concession to what you think you're gonna collect in cash.
That's what we're listing as contract.
That's what we're listing as net accounts receivable price, gross charge minus price concession gets us to that net accounts receivable, and at the same side, we're getting net revenue, and those two equal. When we receive cash, that has nothing to do with income. That's just saying it's no longer an account receivable, it's now cash in the bank.
It's similar to, you have a payable, so if someone sends you a bill, your credit card statement at the end of the month, you effectively have accounts payable and cash sitting up here, and when you pay that cash, you reduce the payable. In this case, when you collect that receivable, you increase that cash. So effectively, you can run a business with zero cash as long as you have enough receivables, because every time the cash comes in, you just pay your bills. And so that receivable is really where the revenue goes when it's generated.
Is that as clear as mud?
No, but it's actually been really helpful, especially if you're using small pieces or I like the explanation of, that bad debt, or, the further out it gets, the less we're actually accounting for in that accounts receivables. That is really helpful.
So once the financial statements are prepared, it's typically the financial ratios or certain calculations of those amounts accompanying your financial statements that are really helpful in looking at your trending, benchmarking yourself against other facilities or other centers, and also for planning your budgeting purposes. So looking at some of the key ratios that are reviewed, on the balance sheet side, as you already referenced, the days in net accounts receivable, that is calculated by taking your accounts receivable balance as of that period divided by your average daily revenue. And what that is telling you is how many days does it take to collect your accounts receivable on average. And as Will mentioned, most of our hospitals, we see that typically in the 45 to 50-day range. Obviously, if you're going through something like a system conversion, we can see that number go way up because it's going to take longer to get a bill out the door and get those accounts receivable collected. Another very common one on the balance sheet is your days cash on hand, and that is your cash divided by your average daily operating expense. And what that does is it tells you the number of days that you can continue to pay your operating expenses with your existing cash. So if I didn't collect another dollar of cash, how many days can I continue to pay my expenses? That again is another, it's referred to as a liquidity measure, but it's looked to as, how healthy is your balance sheet, how much, cash do you have to pay your expenses?
This I always equate back to the old adage, you should have 3 to 6 months of your salary in the bank. And so hospital, for a good benchmark, wants 6 months of expenses sitting on the balance sheet of cash.
And that's a calculation that we look at quarterly when we go to make the distribution. So if you're familiar, you have a joint venture, there's that cash distribution, member distribution page. And we consider that we leave a certain amount of cash, certain amount of days cash on hand behind when we make a distribution.
Moving to the income statement side, some of the key ratios that are typically reviewed is one, your operating margin, and that is looking at your operating income or loss divided by your total operating revenue. And what that is telling you is it measures how profitable your department operations are. Your gross or net revenue per encounter, I know this is one that's typically, yes.
Can you stop there for a minute? Operating margin, operating income, can you just go through those and, like, on our income statements, where do we find which indicators?
Yep. And so your operating margin is going to be what the difference between your operating revenue and your operating expense. It's your net income or it's your bottom line based on those operations, that's your operating income. And what that's doing is it's then taking that number, your net operating income, and dividing it by just your operating revenue to say this is what was generated from these operations. Whether that's $1 million, so we're looking.
So in this case, Q1 actual, $135,000 is your operating income, and your operating revenues were $256,000. So your operating, I'm sorry, which ratio were, yes, your operating margin is about 50%.
We would not necessarily have the net operating margin because we tend not to have things that would be considered income or expense outside of operations. It's all an operating income statement.
So as an example of that, maybe the hospital you're at, last year the investment market was great. So much of hospital bottom lines, if you went to the bottom line outside of operations, was comprised of investment income on the investment portfolio that they have. So their operating margin, for let's say, I heard Van Wert earlier, could be 2% operating margin, but if they have a nice investment portfolio, it could be 8%. That would be the total margin because they had such a good investment year. Now next year could be the opposite. But operations is what you're making on day to day, and effectively the rest is some type of investment play in most healthcare organizations, whether it be a debt investment play, whether it be a cash or stock investment play. But those are mostly what is outside of operations on a hospital financial statement. Were there others, or did that help answer the question?
So gross or net revenue per encounter is really for average, and gross or net revenue for each visit or procedure that you would be bringing in. So obviously some procedures are going to bring in more revenue than others, and that's just measuring that in total for a specific period of time. Your net revenue percentage to charge would take your net revenue divided by your gross revenue and present the amount of revenue collected as a percentage of gross charge. So what are you collecting for the charge, the 100% of the charges that are in your charge master? And the difference in that really would be then what are you taking as a price concession? The difference between what your gross charges and what you're ultimately going to collect would be but this would be kind of your reimbursement percentage.
One thing I'll always say about this net revenue percentage you charge is that if you went to 5 different hospitals, this number may be all over the board. And it's based on 1, their charge structure, and 2, their contracts. So some people have high charge structures, good contracts. Some people have high charge structures and poor contracts. So this really, when we look at this, when we talk to clients, it's what is your trend? Is your trend 30%, 30%, 30%, 15%? Or is your trend 50%, 50%, 50%, 50%? In the world we're in, governmental payers are not going to pay as much as typical price increases are. So if you increase your charges by 4%, governmental payers in Columbus and Washington are going to give you 1 if you're lucky. Then this net percentage to charge is going to keep eroding away, but it should just be little bit by little bit. You shouldn't see big jumps in this number.
One of the questions that strikes me, maybe to talk about, compare across organizations and then allocate resources based on that comparison. The same thing is going on here. When I was at Blanchard Valley as the CEO, I'm looking at our operating margin percentage because there's, like we have 50 hospitals we're comparing that to. And as the CEO, that gives me a quick indication of overall performance. It's like a scorecard. When your children bring home or brought home their grade cards, you do an A, they're doing everything, B, they're still C, well, D, well, now maybe we need to take a course correction. What this is like that grade card. It's giving people an indication of where to allocate resources to. You have a high operating margin percentage compared to your peers. Well, you think about that, that's measuring what was my net revenue compared to all my expenses. Well, I'm probably allocating my expenses very efficiently because I'm getting a higher level of net revenue on a proportional basis to my peers. I got a good program, I'm probably gonna be happy. If everybody else is at 50%, as well pointed out, and I'm at 25%, now I'm the CEO asking, well, why for that dollar salary committed is everybody else getting 50 cents and I'm only getting 25 cents? I want to understand that. The ratios below start to lead you to know where to look, to understand. It could be, you hear us talk about payer mix all the time. It could be that my clinic's seeing 80% of a very low payer, i.e. Medicaid, and everybody else is only at 20%. Or it could be that we also track remember it's compensation expense as a percent of encounter. If my compensation expense is at $100 per encounter and everybody else is at $50 per encounter, then I want to look into why am I putting more people in to get the same level of revenue. So it's that top one that a CEO is going to jump to, then the bottom ones are going to start allowing them to know where to go explore with their questions, if that makes sense. That's the why you put it out there. You're building an easy path to questions. Is my
Yep.
There's two things you manage in health: volume and compensation. Those are by far and away the largest two variables that you can affect.
People and people.
Yeah.
Just two different types of people.
And your your compensation, your benefits expense is typically about 50% of your expenses on your balance sheet, or real close to it. So if you can manage that number, you can manage the majority of your or at least half of your expenses of your business line.
So said another way, every dollar of cash you bring in, 50 cents is going to personnel.
So these obviously are both looking, diving a little bit deeper than into, as John alluded to, some of those the compensation per encounter and benefits percentage of compensation. So benefits percentage of compensation is measuring of your total compensation expenses, how much of that related to employee benefits provided. So all of these ratios obviously are used to, as John mentioned, they're a scorecard you use it to compare yourself to maybe other, like clinics or departments, or also looking at how you've trended over, the years or throughout the year. And they're used to then to budget and to allow for financial planning as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will. Yeah.
One more thing maybe to think about. You might ask yourself, why does everybody put it in percentages to compare? Well, what it does is it makes a entity like Blanchard Valley that does 20-some thousand encounters comparable to an entity like Magruder that does 3,000. By using percentages, all of a sudden now I can put everybody on the same playing field and take volume out of the equation and get comparisons. So that's why they go to the CEOs are always worried about that percentage comparison, because they want to be able to be on I call it an equal playing field to compare. You spend all your time trying to tell your kids not to compare, there's nothing good that comes out of comparison, and I understand all that, but that's what that scorecard does in a nutshell. And the guys that are in the positive end really love the comparison. The guys that are in the negative end are like me. They're pulling their hair out and saying, why is this like this? Well, you might add on to that. Right?
No, I would agree with you. I think, as you said, it allows for a baseline for everybody versus, well, I'm not as big, or you can drop the excuses in my mind. Good. We have another question. I like it. By the way, wait, before you ask, raise your hand if you've asked a question. I know there's a few more.
She walked out.
Okay. So either we need to move John to this side of the room, or this side needs to wake up. Okay? Go ahead.
So my question I'm getting a lot lately is on contracts, and I don't know if this is relevant for this discussion, but we're new, and I'm new to Tennessee. We're relatively new to the Tennessee market.
Can you sing Rocky Top?
But, and I'm very limited understanding of the contract process in the hospital, but it seems to vary by facility, and I imagine that's how they negotiate their contracts. But when I go down to Dayton, Tennessee, they're saying, well, we're bumping you into an outpatient ambulatory surgery where your SI joint injection falls into category 2, so we're only going to pay you $80, where our other hospital partners will say, we've contracted a fee for that CPT code, and it's much higher. And I'm having trouble, I'm clinical, processing this, and is there a large variation in state contracts? Do you have much?
So there can be variation. I think your next speaker probably is going to be able to talk a little more in depth about that.
There is a lot
Keith
of
is here.
things
Yep.
between the states,
Yeah.
I mean, and then if they're pushing you into an ASC, I assume that's a downward payment.
Well, we're in the hospital outpatient surgery, but they're saying you can have a lat chole, you can have an SI joint injection, and there's 6 levels. And your SI joint is a level 2, so we're only going to pay you $90. That's it. And that's, which maybe your epidural is $60. I'm just having trouble. That's not anything I've seen before, and I'm not familiar.
I'm looking at my colleagues as I say this in the room. An insurance company, an insurance contract is a living document that's open for interpretation. And an insurance company, and you gotta correct me if I'm wrong, is like playing gambling in Vegas. If you think about it, many times the insurance company knows the rules and how to interpret the document better than the hospital because they're doing it across hundreds of hospitals. And also, an insurance company will interpret the contractual rules to their favor until challenged and pushed back upon. The one place you hear it regularly is every hospital has a good denial management program. My guess is what you really have is a situation of the hospitals entered into a new program. The insurance company recognizes we've never gotten these types of bills from this hospital before. So we're going to interpret these bills to our most advantageous manner until challenged differently. The other thing that could have happened is because the hospital entered into the contracts before they entered into the program, the hospital could have accepted a contract that they conceded on this point because it wasn't material. And so what, in that kind of situations there, I think what we would need to do is really go back and have somebody like Keith or go in and read the contract, interpret the contract, and help us understand, is the insurance company interpreting it in the manner that the contract is written? Then you have, once you have that information, then you begin to develop a course of action, how you want to address it, which the course of action might truly be, we're just not going to do anything about it because that contract has broader, that's a minor part, we have broader ramifications as a hospital with that.
How often do they
Please.
negotiate contracts with insurance companies?
It depends.
Depends on the term of the contract.
But I would tell you that I've ran across hospitals that have had a Blue Cross agreement for 10 years and have never wanted to open it up because as soon as I open it up, I'm going to have to discuss rates, and I don't mind the negatives because the positives outweigh it. So it's a very, I don't know, guys, you gotta.
No, you're right, John. Anytime you open up a contract, you're likely as a hospital losing leverage. So there, and especially if it's one specific item. So here's an example from hospitals that we see. Hospital will give their shirt away on the physician practices that they are contracting for, so that they can make the money up on the inpatient, outpatient hospital services. So it's a yin and a yang for them. You happen to be caught in the middle that maybe you just have this little slice, and they're not thinking about this little slice in comparison to the big pie.
So, do we have benefit of knowledge about those contractual rates as we're negotiating and putting together performance and things?
Yes, we go and ask, and we give them the charge master and say, please tell us what the reimbursement rates would be and then the charge rate. And we look at, for these codes, what is it, but the other side of it is, and Ray, I don't know the details, I don't
Well,
know.
she showed me the contract that when,
Pictures on your phone, Sarah.
And I'm not trying to throw Ray under the bus, but the other side of it is you go back to what Will was saying, and pain management's a really, really big program, and Blanche Valley, everybody knows that. It was less than 1% of the total revenue that we billed for the entire organization. And so thinking that we were gonna go do something for pain management that would list 99% of the revenue of pain management, it just wasn't gonna happen. And I think it goes back to what Jeff said earlier today. As you walk through these, you learn things every time you do one hospital bill, one hospital deal, and you become more cognizant of what goes on, because my guess is these guys would say if you see one Blue Cross contract, you've seen one Blue Cross contract. If you see one Medicaid Advantage contract, you've seen one Medicaid Advantage contract. These things have a lot of variables, and we pay people a lot of money in my prior life to do a lot of modeling behind the scenes to figure out what was the best deal for our organization with the current mix of services that we were providing to maximize our reimbursement. And which came down to, as Will said, there were places where we, my language, they probably agree with me, we threw them under the bridge because it was better to sacrifice them than the greater whole. And then I was really nice because then what I'd say is you still gotta go hit your benchmarks to everybody else.
So Brenda and I just need to make pain management the most valuable service for them.
But I do think that's a reasonable thing to take back and let's look at it, let's research it. And if we need to get expertise in helping us become those expertise, but the contracting process.
You may find though, if they just did the contract, you might not have a window for 3 to 5 years. So unless they want to reopen it, and like Will said, then you're at risk of the whole system going backwards.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna comment, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, the thing you have to think about too, when we're getting the information from our potential partners, we're asking for what their charges are set at and their reimbursement by pay or class. But we don't get it, one, at the CBT level, I know we've discussed that, but additionally, most of these sites do not have paying programs, so even though it may be included in their charge master, they may not have necessarily ever charged it and then received the denial to know that then that is not part of their contract. So most of the time, they don't even realize it's a problem until it's a problem.
However, if they are saying that they are billing at an ambulatory rate, doesn't that include to us that that could possibly be at a lower rate than what it would be if it's constantly?
Yeah. So that was probably different when they just, that's a unique situation. And
Yeah, I'd love to read the agreement. I mean, that's what it looks like. Because you're in a, you just have to see the agreement. Those are great questions.
Might even take it one step further and the one department or even the one procedure that you're talking about, John talks about it impacting the entire hospital. It's really what's moving the entire healthcare industry to consolidation because these small hospitals, community hospitals are signing up with the large health systems so that they can get those beneficial contracts that a larger organization would have with a United or an Aetna or one of the others.
One more thing to mention on this is, so we are talking about 25 to 30% of the revenue as we talk about this, because in typical case, 50 to 70% of your revenue is going to be Medicare, Medicaid, or self-pay patients that aren't under these type of contracts. So, you know, Medicare is going to pay what Medicare is going to pay. Medicaid in most states is going to pay consistent across the state, and they kind of fall within ranges unless they have certain Medicaid programs that are scattered throughout the U.S. We have about 15 minutes, and I'm on a mission to get this half of the room to interact over here. So we're going to talk about budgets, and we're going to run through this quickly. I'm going to ask that you hold questions till the end of the 20 slides, and then we'll ask any questions so that we can move through these slides quickly. 2 types of budgets. Think about personally, operating budgets, what the inflows, what the outflows are on a month-to-month basis at your household. Capital budgets, I'm going to buy a car, I'm going to buy a house. Oh my God, I have to pay college tuition. Those type of things are capital budgets. Integration between. So you have operations. If you're not making money on a monthly basis, it's hard to make the investment long-term into the capital budget area. So, operating budgets for you individually, as a pain center, for the hospitals, it's the financial roadmap as we've talked about, and it represents the actions on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter, year-to-year basis of what do we expect our financials to look like, and then we're going to talk here shortly about the actuals in comparison to that. Who participates? So raise your hand if you've participated in a budget before. Okay, let's rephrase. Raise your hand if you haven't. Okay, we have the 101 budgeting course. That's next week. Same place, same time, but you buy your own lunch. Who participates? Departments, finance, administration, board, medical staff. Those are hospital personnel. In your case, many of you participate, and if you haven't been given that opportunity, you'll probably get that opportunity at some time as you continue to develop your leadership skills. But what the focus of this is that if administration is telling you how to prepare your budget as a hospital department, it's not going to work. You have to be invested. Again, I'll go back to my kid scenario. If my kid is not invested in cleaning their room and I can't find a way to vest them in that, as soon as I turn my back, their room's not going to be clean. So they have to determine, you as the operators are best positioned to determine what your expectations, what the budget is for your department on a year-to-year basis. So, preparing the budget, monitoring budget versus actual, and if you want to flip Ashley to the next slide. Here's finances responsibilities. So I would guess that some of this information you get from financial staff at the hospitals. I bet Brad and his team may have some of this information that they pass out to you when they're doing budgets for the organization as a whole. Administration lists kind of theirs. The key here is the strategic planning. So when you're thinking about the hospital, they're thinking about that 99%, 100%. So they may not be thinking about pain management specifically, but they're thinking about how can we continue to improve this organization? Where are we going to allocate our resources, our budget, within the entirety of the entity? So obviously, we're all sitting here today because hospitals have allocated operating budget numbers to pain management. They've identified it as something critical. They haven't allocated 100% of the budget, but they've allocated enough to say this is a critical service. We need this. Administration leadership says, let's make sure we're doing this. Physicians. Any physicians in the room?
We only have one at a time.
I gotta ask this question then. Any lawyers? Next slide. Next slide. Wow. No, next slide. Seriously. Board of Trustees has mainly lawyers too, so we're gonna flip past that. Here's the budget process. Timetable, establishing a timetable. Development of budget assumptions. So you need to understand what the assumptions are, what you're playing with. So what happens if the largest employer in town goes out of business? Well, that is a significant budget assumption for next year. Distribute budget packets, information. You got to collect information before you do a budget. Prepare the budget. That is an iterative process. It doesn't happen once. Here's my budget, I'm done. No, you go in, you talk about things, you come back, you do a different analysis. You come back with something different. Sometimes those pesky accountants ask you the 5th time to cut that budget, right? They always ask for cutting. They never say you can have more. Review and compile, present budget to administration. So really then pulling it all together. Present budget to board and communicate the final budget. So communicating back out. Here, as collectively as a whole and individually, here's where we ended up. Key elements. We've talked about these: volume, workload indicators, statistics, expenses, revenue, many times driven off of what happened last year, plus what you believe is going to happen this year. But as I said, if you think that you're going to get a 4% price increase, you are working in the wrong industry. Statistics, very important. So you need to understand, am I going to have 100 episodes a day? Am I going to have 1,000 episodes a day? Am I going to have 10 episodes a day? And so understanding the statistics, the volatility of statistics. So I can tell you in the state of Ohio, someone said Magruder, right? Who's from up at Port Clinton? Okay. Busiest months, June, July, August, because everybody's up there thinking they can do something that when they were 21 years old they could do. Not anymore. So you have to understand that volatility in statistics because that volatility drives revenue. I think we can go ahead and skip this one. Salaries and benefits, we've talked about the 50%. Here's some industry items though. Labor shortage. I don't think anyone's saying that there are tons of physicians, tons of nurses, tons of techs out there. So sometimes there has to be a differential in pay for labor shortage. Employee health insurance premiums and pension expense. So your 401k that you were talking about earlier. Again, all of these things drive back to that 50% of your revenue is paid or charged out to people, to labor expenses. And then other expenses, so you need to have an understanding of these. If you went through the budget process before, you probably understand what's in that budget. I think we talked about most of these. Demographic changes, the employer moving out. Industry changes, so you're not getting more reimbursement. Technology changes, a lot of things drive back to technology, so I'm hoping that all of you are using electronic health records. But if the organization goes through and changes to a different EHR, what a pain that is. And then finally, new service product lines. So say something else comes about that you can get into a different service line or get into a new venture. Those are important considerations in your budget year over year, because it's not going to be the same, not static, not consistent with what you've seen in the past. I think I'm wrapping up, Ashley, am I not?
You are. I'm kicking you out because we're going to talk just a little bit further in more
Perfect.
detail about your budget. So your revenue budget, and this is again, it's kind of just taking it down to a more micro level, but you're going to look again at what are your expected volumes, what's your expected revenue per unit, what is the impact of rate changes, and has there been any changes to contracts or regulations that then also impact your deductions from revenue or your price concessions. As we talked about a little bit already earlier, the rate changes are driven by what your desired margin is, your market sensitivity, what is your payer mix, there's typically inflationary forces, and defensible pricing. So pricing and rate increases, it's definitely an art, not a science, and the process, I'm sure, is different everywhere you go. So after the budget is developed, there's more. So it's great if you have a budget, but if no one's going to take responsibility for the budget or tracking where you're at compared to the budget, then all that work is kind of for no reason. So here's just an example responsibility report we would see for a hospital department or really any organization and what you're typically looking at there. And the key is really that you're looking at these, if you want to move forward, is that you're looking at where you're at on a monthly basis, on a regular basis. And if you have significant variances, which you have to obviously define what you're going to determine to be a significant variance, that you are looking into those, whether they're positive or negative, to say, why did we fall so far from where we expected? So successful budgeting reporting is obviously researching the variances, documenting what you're finding, and developing an action plan based on that. So what changes or what actions can I take to make sure that I'm either revising the budget because it wasn't set appropriately to begin with, or what actions can I take to make sure that I'm tracking more in line with the budget that has been set, and obviously carrying that action plan out. When analyzing your operating results, you want to remember that obviously when you're capturing charges, those are gross. You also have to consider those revenue adjustments, as we talked about, for your price concessions. And your expenses, when you're looking at an expense for your department, that's not going to include any indirect costs that the hospital may be, allocating to you outside of what you're looking at. So just keeping that kind of bigger picture in mind. And we talked about operating margin earlier, and we want to talk just a little bit about contribution margin, operating margin, just to provide kind of a little high level, what's the difference? So when you're looking at your contribution revenue, you're really focused on your direct expenses, so your net revenue compared to those direct expenses that you're going to see in your department financial. Operating margin takes it a step further and says, what's your contribution margin? So what did you calculate in the previous step? And also then back out your indirect expenses. So in some of the examples of your indirect costs are on here. You might have some IT costs that are allocated, billing, housekeeping, maintenance, etc., administration. And we just put some numbers to it, just to provide, just another way of looking at this. So your net revenue, so in this case you had gross revenue of $3 million. Your reimbursement percentage was 45%. So you had net revenue of $1,350,000 and direct expenses on your department level of $1 million. So your contribution margin was $350,000. That's great when you're looking at negative. So that's, again, more so just to provide perspective on how that might be viewed from more of a hospital level outside of your department. So what is business planning? Each department within the hospital is going to be looked at as a business unit. It'll be looked at individually for profitability and what's the business case for keeping that service line open, whether it's a community need, etc. Some of your planning opportunities is looking at, are there services that you should be providing that you should be considering offering? Expanding hours, who's your population, like what's your patient population? Are they all retired, so they're all coming in between 9 and 5, or are these individuals working and they need to have some evening hours a couple times a week? And then also new equipment. A lot of times equipment or investment in facilities is also another way to attract patients to your facility. So some of the keys in effective planning is understanding both the financial and the operational impact to these decisions that you're making. And obviously then bringing in all the affected parties from the beginning. So whether it's IT, ancillary services, marketing, bringing all those parties to the table so that you can have an effective upfront conversation. And obviously you're always going to have to make sure you're keeping in mind what the impact on quality, patient outcomes will be, if there's regulations, what your customer market, what that looks like, and also the impact on your staffing productivity. Again, that 50%, adding a few patients, are we going to be able to manage the staffing level that's going to require? So overall, you want to do your homework, bring the right people to the table for those discussions, and incorporate documents such as budgets, and obviously you want to measure and report your results as well. Decision support.
Yes, so we're going to stop here for a moment and answer questions on budgeting, especially from this side of the room. I'm not even looking over there yet. I need a question. Wow, okay. Anyone over here? No questions on budgets. You're all good. You feel good about budgets. You're all asleep. I see some people sleeping. I'm not happy. I'm an accountant. People shouldn't sleep when I talk.
Well, what do you say to a doctor when you walk into the...
Did she leave before we asked this question? I didn't know. I should have asked that question to start. Sorry.
When you have a budget of, say, we need to see 1,000 patients this year, and you see 500, and you miss budget, and you have a doctor who says, well, the reason we missed budget is because we had a bad payer.
Well, I think, actually, I don't know if it was in that section or the next section, but it's really about providing information. So, physicians are great people, believe it or not, but they are very analytic. They want to understand the why, and so they may think they know the reason. But if you arm them with the data, we found more often than not that if you show them the trends, show them the data, that they can then think about it and get back to, this is probably the solution. So they are problem solvers. So give them the data, and usually, as long as they're not too vested in their position, they can understand, where that comes from.
And a follow-up question: if you budgeted for 1,000 people and you staff for 1,000 people, is there a bad payer mix until you get to 1,000 people? Said another way, isn't it true that each patient coming in that has incremental revenue until you get to your volume budget that you have provided these staff and resources for is a good patient? If you start to go above that and add additional resources, I guess then I'm saying, is that the time to look at the mix of your patients versus the volume?
Yes, effectively, if you're going to get paid 15 cents for that hour or nothing because there's not a patient there, it's better to get paid 15 cents if that's what you're referring to. Now, it's always better to get paid 50 cents for that hour, but if you don't have that 50% patient coming in the door in that time slot, then obviously the 15% is better, or 15 cents is better than nothing. So yeah,
You
it's...
don't want to take that 15 cents and go back and look at the staffing and availability of service and ratchet that down back to.
Right. Yep. And in some departments, it's easier for you to take those patients and get those patients coming in the door. An inpatient department hospital, if there's nobody out there that needs inpatient services, they may have to actually bring that budgeted number of staffing down. Do you have a question, sir?
I was just gonna say, so really, payer mix doesn't come into play until you hit your budgeted volume.
In my mind, on a monthly basis, probably. Yeah, because if you're looking at that for the whole year, there may be some shifts up and down, but really monitoring that on a monthly basis, if you're well below budget in the number of patients that come in, then you need to increase your patients or decrease your staffing low enough that some of those patients drop off that aren't going to pay as well.
I'd just love to see a show of hands of how many times have you been below your volume budget that the doctors walked in and said the problem is a bad payer.
Oh, I can raise my hand on that one too. Did Jeff have a question?
So, yeah.
Thank you, Jeff, repping this side of the room. Well done.
So, we have a budget with a partner 6 months into it. We're really off to the negative. And somebody says, I got an idea, let's go talk to the hospital about changing the budget. Why is that a bad idea?
Well, so I will tell you there are these things called rolling budgets now. I'm not a big fan of them, but they would allow you to change the budget. But really, if you
where you're not in that situation.
Yeah, right. Yep. So really, that is probably not the best idea because you have set a course, a goal for this year. It's just like if you wanted to do something specific at your house. If this is where I want to get, now maybe I can't get all the way there, but I should continue to strive for that budgeted goal. And really, I cut it down into months. So even if you've missed the first 6 months, that doesn't mean that for the last 6 months of the school year, buddy, you can't pull your grades up to an A. So try to meet that monthly budget in July, August, September, October, and November, and try to make up some of that first 6 months. But if you're just cutting and you just say, oh well, let's change it, that's probably not the best case scenario. Now next year, you can reopen that, reevaluate it. Is it right? But typically you like to have that budget set for the year.
But is it, so you have this hospital where you aren't making the budget, and they know that there's no realistic way you're going to, but doesn't it make sense for them then to look at the expenses and start cutting the expenses? But in this case, they say those expenses are already budgeted, and they won't even look at the expenses.
So you don't have control over those expenses as the department manager?
Not without them agreeing to it.
Okay. Well, that goes back to if you set the budget, but you don't have the control, that's not the ideal situation. You should have control over both the revenue line and the expense line in both the budget and also the performance of the budget.
But in that example, you wouldn't necessarily adjust the budget, you would adjust your operating expense.
Yep.
Right, but they.
Which wouldn't show then, hopefully, improved variance to, that's rolling with your volumes. But you wouldn't recast your budget to do that, you would.
Right. But you would want to, if you know you aren't making budget, adjust
Well, absolutely.
expenses.
Then you gotta,
But,
Yeah. But
right,
that-
but is there some reason why a hospital wouldn't wanna
Yeah.
readjust their expenses when they know that they're losing their shirt?
Um,
I can't figure that
I
one
guess
out.
one could be patient service, if they believe that they have to have so many RNs or so many techs for the amount of service. This would often be like an inpatient setting where you have to have so many people on the floor. In this case, I don't know the reasoning behind that, but it doesn't sound like best business practice.
I would say that if that's their attitude, then the rest of their hospital's in trouble.
Probably true.
We need to quit talking about my hospital.
I was gonna say.
To full-time equivalents, I think.
They should pay, and I do believe many organizations pay a lot to that. So it is on almost every statistical report that we would see is what is the budgeted FTEs and what is the actual FTEs on a month-to-month basis. The smaller the organization, probably the easier to get your hands around that. But again, it should be a primary driver because at the end of the day, it makes up 50% of the expense of the organization.
So would you say as an advisor to a hospital, you would go in and say, if you want to run a good hospital, be, my word, maybe use a different word, fanatical about your FTE allocation and distribution?
Fanatical is an interesting word, but yes, you have to have a clear focus on that.
So you as an expert on the outside would say, if you want to run a good operation, you have to have a very clear focus on the utilization of your people.
Yes, I would agree. And getting, one of the things I think hospitals are doing a better job at, but can continue to do a better job at, is getting the right level of person serving that patient at the right time. So a real focus on the utilization, but you can't have people standing around. We at Point Marin, same thing. We don't want to have 10 Ashleys and 9 of them doing nothing. If I had 10 Ashleys, I could tell you they'd all be busy. But anyway, but same thing is you want to focus on people because that is a significant amount of the expense going out the door, and you want to right size that so that you're able to reinvest. The one thing we didn't talk about earlier in the budget is when you make a bottom line, when you get that equity, it allows you to reinvest, whether it be reinvest in property, plant, and equipment, reinvest in your people. That is the point of making that equity, making that bottom line is to be able to reinvest it in the future. We are out of time, and so we are going to pass on the last section of our presentation. But thank you again for having us. If you have any questions, Ashley knows everything. Please connect with her. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let PMG go.